mistake. Meghan Markle thoroughly researched this particular information, this particular interview, which was groundbreaking when you think about it, way back in January 1970, and broadcast on the BBC, interviewed by Kenneth Harris, and this had been, well, literally ongoing for many years. Of course, the same couldn't be said of the two former royals, the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. Well, Meghan had been playing around with Oprah Winfrey for a couple of years, but she said, if you remember, the time wasn't quite right yet. Now, Wallis Simpson and the King, well, it took him a lot of persuading to do it, but she was very pushy, Wallis, and also there was something else attached to it that they both very much needed, and more importantly, the timing was paramount, particularly for Wallis. As ever, let me explain. Morning, good to see you today, and as ever, thank you for taking the time out for joining me. I'm glad you enjoy these history look backs, these flashbacks, because as I say, I'm lucky enough now to be able to meet some people who were literally either working around that area, working with these individuals, and they tell you some far more interesting insights into the story. I know it sounds sort of kind of unkind at points, but when you look at a lot of these documentaries today, you can see that they're put together by people that don't necessarily have a passion. So they don't look any deeper than what's presented to them on those fact sheets. But if you go and find people, if you go and interview them and chat with them, they'll always tell you a little bit of something extra that you didn't necessarily know. Everybody feels that they know everything about Wallis Simpson, and you could think, whether you like her or not, she certainly remains an active part of British history. Whether you like this or not, Meghan Markle will remain an active part of British royal history for many years to come. How she will be portrayed will be, well, interesting to see. But of course, many of us might not be around for that, you understand. Now, what I find fascinating about this particular story is this, because way back in, well, October 1969, finally the BBC had managed to secure an interview with the King and Wallis Simpson. This had been going on for years. The interviewer, Kenneth Harris, was desperate to kind of do it. And it was a fascinating thing in many respects, because a few years before, well, way back in 1956, they'd already sat down with a very popular US TV chat show host called Edward R. Murrow. He had a program called Person to Person, and it was really, different of its day, because he literally, what we would now consider just going via satellite, but this was groundbreaking in those particular years. Everybody remembers the one in the farmhouse with Milton, Amy Green and Marilyn Monroe. That picked up masses, millions of people, and that was her very first time on television being interviewed. Now, Edward R. Murrow, well, he had to do a lot to get Wallis and the King, namely, not only a fee that really today would be around about $1 million, if you look at it, but also he had to shave off some of the sponsorship money for the show, along with a free car for him and her, just to get that interview. All lost, of course, now in the files of those particular channels, but there, if you dig deep enough, you know what I'm saying. Now, this particular interview with the BBC was, as I say, again, a reason behind it was simply this. While the King wasn't keen on the idea, because obviously he felt he'd done it, she basically wanted her story to get out there, and she wanted the story clearing up. So literally from his lips, the idea of whether they were happy or not, what sort of life they'd led, all of that sort of stuff. She wanted this on record because she knew behind the scenes that her man wasn't very well, and as we then saw, didn't really last too much longer. If this was actually down on tape, on film, then people couldn't hit back at her. He'd said it. You see the manipulation, some people might suggest. But here again is where it gets really interesting, because in the original interview, as I say, which was recorded in the October, they discussed many things, groundbreaking things, including this particular meeting and this particular salute. And this was very, very, shall we say, damaging, as one can imagine, to the British monarchy at that time. But in the final edit, it was missing. But she did have the master tapes. Wallis had the master tapes, and they went missing also upon her demise. Fascinating again when you think about it. But moving forward, her greatest achievement for making money really came from this. You see, while the BBC didn't really want to pay them too much money, and they couldn't because of that era, everything was documented and literally in the public domain, Wallis got round this idea very cleverly, because she said, I hear that LPs, long playing records, are now the big thing. And the fact that she'd, of course, commented on the likes of the miniskirt by proclaiming, of course, well, at least you know what you're getting, don't you? She was already shock value in things, you understand? And this really was kind of like, well, revolutionary at the time, coming from, some suggest, a former member of the British monarchy. But what she did was, the deal with the BBC was that they put out an album, a long-playing LP, which is now a collector's edition. But you see, Wallis, a little bit like someone else years down the line, decided, well, this wonderful idea, yes, absolutely, but they'll be requiring royalties. And according to the documents, it was a 70-30 split, 70 to them, 30 to the BBC. Of course, at this point, they've really done a lot to sell the interview already. But it just goes to show, doesn't it, how shrewd she possibly was. And of course, when you think about it also, she gave out these albums to friends at Christmas and parties, and literally had listening parties so that people could hear the interview and then comment upon it. Well, how could you comment upon it if you're sat in her lounge? Can't say anything negative, can you? And that's exactly how this well, some people say, historical interview actually came to point. Kenneth Harris has said himself previously that it was one of his most challenging interviews because just on the evening before of the recording, the King apparently didn't want to go ahead. And it took a lot of persuasion from Wallis to finally make him say yes. He felt, and as ever, allegedly, that he was under duress, didn't want to do it, but would do anything to please Wallis. Talk about history repeating itself, right? Neil Sean in the very heart of London.